What is this? What's a snom and why? It's a snare. It's a tom. You know, I need props. Hold on. Everybody, look on the stage. It's a snare. It's a tom. It's snom. That was dumb. So the term snom has come into use in recent years, and no, it has nothing to do with COVID or any other kind of medical procedure. Of course, we're talking about a portmanteau of snare and tom. So how exactly are we supposed to make these two elements come together? Almost got it. And usually this applies when somebody takes something like a 14-inch or a 16-inch floor tom, spreads some wires across the bottom head, adds the appropriate goodies, and essentially can select between either treating that thing as a tom-tom or a snare drum. Thomas Lang's, I think, Red Hot Rod kit or Hot Rod Red kit. If you watch the video of him playing around on that one, everything is a snare drum. It's like Oprah. You get to be a snare drum, and you get to be a snare drum, and you get to be a snare drum. What if I don't want to be a snare drum? I have a number of redundant drums in my Emerald Green Pacific collection. Essentially, the first of those kits that I got was the ordinary catalog run-of-the-mill 5-piece, consisting of 10, 12, and 14-inch toms, a 22-inch bass drum, and a 5x14 snare. And I bought that along with the White Onyx, if there was a contradiction in terminology there, the White Onyx Pacific drum kit, which I stripped the hardware off of that for the upcoming rebuild project, and actually ended up using the shells for that kit on my Fibes setup. So it came to pass that a complete 7-piece Emerald Green Fade MX kit came up for sale on, I think, Guitar Center. And I happened to have the money, and I was like, this is a serendipitous moment. Let us go ahead and get these drums. Now, of course, buying that kit netted me carbon copies of the 10, 12, and 14-inch tom-toms and a second 22-inch bass drum. I did not get the snare drum for that kit, which I'm not exactly losing sleep over. Those PDP X-Series snares were not exactly any great shakes. Hot tip, when you're making snare drums, make the shell thicker than a tom-tom. Otherwise, it's just a shallow tom-tom with wires on it. Although I am going to contradict myself a bit in that advice, considering how I did this snom build. Now, in addition to all that, I also got the 8-inch tom-tom and the 16-inch floor tom-tom, which was really the incentive for buying this kit. Not to mention that for the price and the availability, I was happy to have that many drums in the arsenal, figuring that I could use the redundant drum sizes, the extra 10, 12, and 14, to experiment around with other projects, while this kit was basically serving as my primary daily driver, monthly driver, while I was preparing to get all the material together to do this big PDP rebuild that I want to do. So one of those redundant toms, the 12-inch, I actually decided to take the suspension tom mount off of it and actually put floor tom legs on it, because I like a 12-inch tom-tom in that first floor tom position. It's a lot more convenient, actually, to put that thing on its own 3 little legs than it is to hang that thing off of the rack. So I went with that. Then I took the other 12x14 and I actually cut that down into a 10x14 and left the suspension mount on that thing. So I actually have a 14-inch rack tom that matches the kit if I ever decide I really need a setup that crazy. Maybe if I'm doing a Green Day tribute band, I can have the big 14-16 tom setup like Trey Cool. So finally, whatever I had left was this 10-inch tom-tom. And I had batted the idea around my head, but when I decided to launch this YouTube channel, I was like, you know, this is exactly the sort of thing that would make a great episode. Let's turn this little sucker into a snare drum. Now, as far as building the drum itself, it was pretty straightforward, actually. My plan was just strip it down. One of the great things about this particular iteration of the Pacific X-Series drums, and by X-Series, let me clarify, I mean LX, MX, and CX drums. These were the oval lug maple kits that were made right up until the Platinum Series came out and basically kicked them off the map. And I say that as distinct from the X7 and the M5, which looked a lot like those in terms of their overall fit and finish, but the way the hardware is installed is a little different, and I don't think the lugs and other components on that were quite as high a quality as the made in Mexico Pacifics. So the great thing about these, I guess you could call them the post-2005 LX, MX, and CX Pacific drums, is that everything was screwed onto the shell, up to and including the vent hole, which is great. It's a standard DW vent hole with a hex on the inside, so you can put an Allen wrench in there and put some channel locks on the other side and just remove the whole smash. So I was able to strip the shell completely down to just the timber, and went ahead and measured the fence on my table saw to cut just a little bit wider than 7 inches. I wanted to take this drum from 8 inches deep down to 7 inches deep. And rather than trying to remove 1 inch off of the shell, which I'm glad I did not do, I actually chose to go a little bit more than 7. That way, if I made the first pass through there and the blade slop got into the shell too much, it would, in any likelihood, take it exactly down to 7, basically just removing that little extra bit that I had left on the shell. Because if you run it through like that and you end up getting more than the depth you wanted, great. You can always remove more wood. It's very, very difficult to go the other way with that. So, fortunately, I managed to nail it on the second pass. And the only reason I didn't get the first pass is because I wasn't paying attention as I was rolling the shell through the saw. If you tried to do a linear push through the saw like you would push any piece of lumber through a table saw, because of the way that fence sits on that cheap piece of crap table saw, it actually ends up landing the blade in different parts of the wood, and it can throw the edge of your shell out of true. So you want to basically pick, what I did is I picked the forward leading edge of the saw blade and ran the shell up into that right there and just consistently rotated it into that leading edge of the saw blade. That way it didn't give the blade or the shell any chance to skew one way or the other depending on the position of the fence. I was just able to roll it through, make my cut nice and clean. I ended up with a nice flat bearing edge, and then I could go through with my router and just freehand my inner and counter cuts. I did a 45-degree inside cut, and I think I did a 45-degree outside cut, but I made it significantly shallower because I was going to round over any hard edges that were left with sandpaper. Just do that by hand. The reason I say it's good also that I measured that 7.5 or 7+ inch depth is not just because the blade slop took it exactly down to 7, but because the amount of shell I cut off only amounted to about 3/8 of an inch, which tells me that this wasn't really an 8 by 10. This was actually like a 7.5 by 10. And I never recut the bearing edge on this thing, so either it was modified by the previous owner, or, I mean, maybe the Mexican PDP plant wasn't as quite so on point with their tolerances. Who knows? Who cares? It's a 7 by 10 now. I basically, in order to locate the lugs and the hardware on the side that had been cut, I just measured down however far the lug spacing was hole to bearing edge on the one side. I copied that over onto the other side. I just laid out side. Yeah, I think I just laid out some masking tape and was able to hammer that out and got all the holes marked and drilled. I had to leave behind the original lug mounting holes, but half of them are covered up by the relocation of the lugs, and the other half are tucked in behind the tension rods where you can't see them. And my snare has extra dry venting. So once I had all the holes drilled, I had recut the bearing edge on the side that I had trimmed down, and I also took a fine file and used that to kind of locate and cut some fairly gentle snare beds into the underside. You can't just leave it flat. You have to cut some kind of a some kind of a snare bed in that area. So I got those laid in. I used the snares, the snare side head, and the bottom hoop with the snare gates on it off of my old Pearl Firecracker 10-inch, and otherwise reassembled the drum as you would any PDP drum, including leaving the suspension tom mount on the thing. Now, placing that thing is somewhat limited because I also added a mag strainer and 3-speed snare butt. So this snare drum is pretty full of hardware, and it's only 7 by 10 inches, but it makes a great little either a popcorn snare or because it's cranked up so high, I actually put it out in front of my 8-inch tom-tom to act as like a high tom-tom when the snares are off, which is perfect because then it makes it perform really well as both snare and tom-tom. And a great auxiliary snare sound, so I'm not repeating the sound of my main 13-inch snare just for the sake of having another novelty drum. So that's how the build on the drum went. It was actually quite simple. It took me 2 hours or less. I had a harder time finding drill bits that I thought would work in the drill press during construction, quite honestly. So now that we've been through all of that, let's test out the drum and see how it sounds. Wasn't that more fun than a barrel of monkeys? Just when I thought I couldn't embarrass myself anymore. Okay, so that was a fun little project, and it's a fun little drum. And it'll be nice to have that extra bit of range in my Emerald Fade kit while I'm using that as my main kind of go-to rig. And as I get into other builds and other projects, we'll see really, we'll get a greater insight into how I think about drums, both selection, setup, and construction, and all of that happiness. It's a lot of boths, I know. And also, at some point in the project, especially the rebuild project, because, you know, doing 5 bass drums and needing hardware for the same, very often, in order to pull that off, to get that bass drum, you end up having to buy complete kits or shell packs. So I may end up with enough extra tom-tom lugs or snare drum lugs hanging around that I can do some other project. And, you know, one of my favorite go-to floor tom sizes is 11 by 13. So wouldn't it be interesting to make an 11 by 13 inch snom as a floor tom, complete with 16 lugs on it and all of the 13-inch snare hoops and heads and hardware that you would expect to find on such a creature, and true to building a proper snare drum, actually give it a thicker shell, maybe put some reinforcing hoops in it. I mean, really beef this sucker up. So much so it would be like having a junior marching snare loosely tuned and pretending to be a floor tom, but dressing it up to match your entire kit. I think, make a note here, kids, I think this is a great idea for a future project. And now I'm putting it out on video, so nobody's going to let me forget it. Actually, I think a lot of people are probably going to let me forget it. Anyway, I think that's enough rambling about this silly little project. And now it's time for my attempt to be Terry Bozzio.